Hello programmers, welcome to Lab 10 in our Introduction to Computer Science with Python, Pandas, and Cartography. This week we're going to look at making layers, and I think I'm going to break this into a few videos. So we're going to start by just going a little deeper into some things we already know how to do, and then I'm going to add a new thing that we haven't done yet, which is to make a map with multiple layers where you could see with the checkbox, you can actually see different information on the same base map. All right, so let's get into it. We load the libraries. We're actually not loading any libraries we haven't seen before. We get our census key, and then we get some data. So this week we are working with languages spoken at home by ability to speak English for the population 5 years and older. So this table is interesting. And I chose it because two things. It has a lot of columns. So I wanted to go over some techniques for working with tables that have a lot of columns. And it also has some null rows in it. Because if there are too few samples, like if there aren't enough people in a group, the census doesn't release the data at all. So I'm pulling it for the states, but even at the state level, we don't get all of the states. There are a few that are missing because there aren't enough people, and to protect their privacy, the census doesn't release the data. So let's just take a look. Things we're familiar with. We get the field names. We're going to get all those names, and then we ask that from the census. You might notice we're using the 1-year census survey for year 2023. Usually we use the 2022 5-year census, but we're using this 2023 1-year ACS, right? And so the fields are all the fields in this table, and the geography that we want are all the states. So state star. Our regular work here, so we load the raw data into the data frame. We rename it based on our column map. And then we're just going to look up the state name from the state FIPS, right? Now, this is new. We're going to drop the null data. So if we want to see it without the nulls, we could run this. And let's just get a couple. We'll get state total, right? Spanish and Chinese. All right, let's say, or we'll get French including Cajun. Why not? Okay, so let's run this now. I'm just going to run it again. And you see, we've got these nulls. So Alaska, they didn't give us any data. And I'm just going to take that out of here. All right. There weren't enough people. So these are the states that don't have any data for them. And once if we run it with drop NA, then they're just gone. So we don't have those records anymore. And that way we're not trying to mix like nulls in when we're doing calculations and things like that. And there's nothing to show, so it's not going to hurt us in the analysis we're doing today. It might be something we're interested in another context, but not here. All right. Now, I run this, and I'm just going to point out a few things. If you do columns.toList, then you'll get this scrollable list. Otherwise, you might get the list with the ... where you can't actually see all the names. So let's just take a look, right? So at the top, I print out found len df.columns in our table. So there are 131 fields, right? And I can see just by looking at it, and this is the very first thing I'm going to do, I need to try to understand what my data is. So total, remember we have one row per state. So total is going to be the total population in that state. And then it's broken down to the only English. and then a bunch of languages: Spanish, French, Haitian, Italian, Portuguese, German, Yiddish, Greek, and so on. So we've got all these language groups, and then we got a couple other fields here like state and GeoID. And so on. So for every language, I have the total number of people who speak Vietnamese, and then the Vietnamese speaker who speak English very well, and the Vietnamese speakers who speak English less than very well. So I have 3 columns per people, per language group, right? So what I'm going to do is I want to drop all of these columns: very well, less than very well, and I'm going to use some Python to make it easier to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a for loop where we go through all the column names, and if any of them have very well in the name, this substring, right, this token, then we want to drop it from our list, and we don't want it, right? So let's see what this looks like. So my old columns, these are the original columns. I make a regular plain old list of them, and then I create an empty list, and this is going to be the columns I want. I call it new cols. So for every column in old columns, run these 2 lines of code. And then we have a little if statement. So if this part is true, if very well is not in column, and column is going to be each column name, then I'm going to add it to the new columns. So now when I'm done, new columns will be all the columns that don't have very well in the name. All right. So we can run this code. Having a little bit of a cat problem here. All right. So we're going to run that code. And it says that we have 47 columns left after we run that, and we can see them, right? So this is the basic syntax of a for loop. We have the for keyword, and this is really a for each, and this is a very common idiom or pattern that we see. So this is called our loop variable, and it's going to change in every iteration, and we're going to do it for each item in a list, right? So old cols are all the column names, and we just loop through them. And then this append is a method in list that just lets us add a new item to the end of the list. Okay, so we see it worked. Total, only English, Spanish, French. Okay, now I'm looking at this. I've got some very long column names. I'm going to, in the next thing, I'm going to rename them to some easier things. And I'm going to use a little bit of Python to help me out here. So what I'm thinking is any column name that has an underscore is a target for something I want to rename, right? So if there's an underscore, I'm going to consider renaming it. And to do that, I'm going to show you this very Python way of doing a compressed for loop that runs this filter, right? So this is called a list comprehension. And I'm just creating this temporary variable x. So we can do it all in one line. And here is, it's going to return whatever value we have here. And this is our for loop. So for loop variable column in list df.columns. And then here's the condition. If an underscore is in column. So I only want col if an underscore is in it, and that becomes x. And I can see right here in display, these are the columns that have an underscore. Right? So this is another way of doing a for loop, and it's just a compressed version of what we did up here. So creating the new cols, doing the for loop, appending it to it. It's exactly the same thing. It's just a more compact syntax for doing it. Now we can do the same thing and create a dictionary at the end. And this is what's actually going to help me. Now that I know these columns, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dictionary to print out that has the column name, the current column name as the key, and the current column name as the value, right? And we see that we won't bother to display X. And we'll see this is col map. So I created this col map. And what I did is I took this, I copied it, and then I pasted it here, right? And I put it back into the same variable name. I'm reassigning it. And I just rename them the way that I want to, right? So instead of French including Cajun, we'll just call it French, make it easier to work with. It includes Cajun, and if we have a data dictionary, we would list that there so that we know what we're talking about, right? This one, I'm not going to change it all, right? So I just don't even need to put that in my map. Anything I don't want to touch, like Serbo-Croatian, maybe I leave that alone. Just delete it. That's not going to be in the renaming. Yiddish. Oops, I did that on the wrong side. So over here, we'll just call it Yiddish, and we'll know it's the family of Yiddish languages, Pennsylvania Dutch, and so on, right? So I go through, I rename them the way I want, and I'm going to undo this until we're back where we were, just because the rest of my code depends on me naming the things the same, and I'm afraid that I wouldn't give exactly the same names. Okay. So in this section, we learned about this filter pattern where we have an old list, we have a filtered list, and we do a for loop, and we check every item against a condition to see if it meets our criteria. We're going to do this like a lot in programming. This is something you do all the time. And in fact, we do it so often that Python has this really compact way of doing it, right? And we could also do other things here. So let's say we wanted to convert all of these to an integer or something. We could do that, and then it maps that function onto it, or so on, right? And I'm just showing you we can do the same thing with the dictionary. This is actually useful in our specific case when we have a lot of columns. It just helps us to write the code more quickly for this next step where we rename our columns. Now, the next thing I need to do is actually understand what data I have and explore the data. What I do here, sorted, built-in function, sorts any list we give it. So I send it a list and I get them in alphabetical order so I can get a sense of what I have. So I've got all these languages and a couple other fields like GeoID, state, and so on. So we're going to use these fields to do our maps and create our analysis. So one thing I want to do is see like which ones are the language columns. So I copy this whole thing, paste it here, and then if it's not a language column, I'm commenting it out. And I'm commenting out English because just because I'm not going to use it in my analysis today, right? But then the other ones, state FP and so on, I'm going to comment them out, right? So what I want to do is see how many speakers of these languages there are. And I can call sum. We've used these aggregate functions before when we're doing group by and things. But if I call sum on all of these columns, I get this data called language counts, right? And it comes back. So this is what we get back. We get the language counts, right? And this is basically a column that has an index. So it's like a column we have, and the column is just the data here, and the language is an index, right? So this is for the entire US. It counts up the number of speakers of each of these languages. Now, what I want to show you to do is we can actually make that, a data frame, and I'll just take you through it briefly. We get the series, we call toFrame on it, and we reset the index. So that basically takes the language and it makes it its own column. We're going to rename the column so they have language and count. And then we sort them by count, right? In place, ascending false. That's why we get Spanish, French, and so on. Actually, it's going to be a different sort once we sort it. And then I'm using our styler here. And remember, the styler doesn't change the underlying data, so we have to show what format returns, not the original language counts, because that's going to be the same thing. Okay, so I run that, and now I have a nice data frame where I have Spanish, and I can read it more easily. There are 43 million Spanish speakers in the country, 3.5 million Chinese speakers, 1.7 million Tagalog, Filipino speakers, and down our list, right? So what we did, we printed out all the columns in a sorted list to make it easy. I copy and paste them here. I removed the rows that I don't want, and I just commented them out. I didn't actually delete them, but you certainly could. And then I ran an aggregate function to get the counts on all of them, the sum. Reset the index to make it a data frame. All right, so I call toFrame and then reset the index. And then I use a little styler. I rename the columns and use a styler to show that data. Right? So this is things we know how to do, but maybe in a new order. The next thing we're going to do is new. Right? So if we go and look at our data, let's see. We have all these columns going across. Now, this is called wide format. But we want our data, well, sometimes we want our data in long format. So we're going to use a built-in, or not a built-in function, but a function that's part of the pandas library of pandas data frame called melt. And what melt does is it will take your columns and change it into rows. So we're going to do the same thing we did here. We have language and count, but we're going to keep the state so we know the language count for each state. So we're only going to have 3 columns, state, language, and count, right? Actually 4, because we're going to put the total in there too. So this is called melt. And when we do it, we're switching from wide format to long format, right? Now melt is pretty confusing, but it's also pretty powerful, and it doesn't take that much code. So what we need to do to pass in is, first thing, I'm going to get just the columns I want. So I want all the language columns and the state and the total, right? And then I call melt. Now melt, the ID vars, the ID variables, are the ones that you're going to get basically an index for. So they are going to stay the same, right? So the total for California, the state, and the total are going to be the same as they were in our original data. The value vars are the ones that are going to get converted to rows, right? And they become the values, and that will become count. And then we have to create a new column. Basically, we're taking the column name and we're going to make that row data. So the variable name is language, and that is going to be the name of the value, right? So it's a little tricky. We have all these are all columns right now. And basically Hindi is going to become the value name, and 940,000 is going to become the value. So they're going to become a row together along with the state and the total. Okay? So here's what we get. We get the state, the total, and then the states are going to be repeated for every language group. So we could say sort values by equals state. And you can see we get Alabama, Wisconsin for every language in our language group, right? I'll show you, we could do count, right? So this is count ascending. We've got 0 Hmong speakers in Alabama and 78 Armenians, okay? And then all the way at the end to Wisconsin, where we have, what's that, 281,000 Spanish speakers in the state. Okay, so this is long data, and we're not actually going to, well, we're going to do one more thing with it just to show you how it's easy to work with. One thing I didn't point out, we can create a percent easily just by dividing these 2 columns, right? We don't need to list all the column names. So this is the kind of thing that you can do much more easily with long data, where we have this new percent column. And here, this is really just a little bit of a review. So we're going to, instead of getting a column by name, we're going to do a filter on our data where we get just the Chinese language. Then we're going to sort it by percent, and we're going to get head 10. So we're going to get the top 10 of them, right? And eventually we're going to change table into styler to make a nice table. But first we're going to rename the columns using this dictionary of aliases, right? We looked at this last week. This is something that we're going to do a lot going forward. And then I create another dictionary with keys, values for formats. So once I rename the columns, the keys need to match the new column names, okay? I create the styler based on these formats. I give it a caption, and then I display the table. So this is the highest percentage of Chinese speakers are in California, then New York, Massachusetts, Washington, Jersey, Maryland, and so on, going down the list, right? So New York and California, more than 3% of the population in those states speaks Chinese. Okay. That's it for long data format for today. Now we're going to start working with our maps. All right. So here we join in the tiger shapes for US states. So this is the states. I read it directly from the census. I save it into a GeoDataFrame called shapes, right? And then I just get the columns I need. Now, to make it easier to do the join, I rename these columns so that one, they don't have any conflicts. They have the name I want them to have at the end, and they match for the join. So here in my old data, I called it state FP, lowercase. In the new data in shapes, it's state FP, capital. So I need to lowercase it. And then I can do the merge, and I call it on shapes because I want my new data to be GeoDataFrame, because I'm going to be making some maps from it. Right? So we merge it on state FP. We do it inner, so we only get the data that's in both data sets, and just showing you what that looks like, that now we have the geometries. And we added the full name here because it wasn't in our original data set, but it's in the GeoData. So why not pull that out of there as well? We didn't bother to pull anything else out of it. Okay. So this is the new thing that we're going to do. We're going to create choropleths in layers. So a choropleth is a shaded area on a map where the shades have some meaningful representation of the data that's used to generate the map. And what we're going to do is show the percentage of Spanish speakers as a choropleth. And a lot of this is review, but we are going to do it as a layer rather than as a map on its own. So let's go through this a little bit more closely. All right. First step, I'll put some comments in here. First step I do is get just the columns I want for the map. Just make it a little easier for me to work with. I can see what's going on if I need to display it or print it out. But basically, we're going to get the Spanish speaker column, the state, the full name of the state, the total people in the state, and obviously we need geometry because we can't make a map without it. I copy it so that none of the changes I make to ES are reflected back in my base data in Langs, right? First thing I do is I calculate a new percentage column. That's the column that I'm going to use to create my choropleth, right? To get the color, I calculate the min and max percent. I get a color map. I've decided to use reds for this. And then I normalize my values in this norm function. Now, this is a little bit new. Where instead of setting color as a column for our layers, we're going to use this style. So the color is going to be the color using our color map. And then all of them are going to be fill capacity 1. So they're going to be completely solid, and weight 1. That's for the lines. All right. So I create a new column called style, which is actually going to hold this dictionary. Okay. And maybe we'd like it to look a little more like that. So we're going to create 3 new columns, one to hold the style, one to hold the tooltip, and one to hold the pop-up, right? The tooltip, I use a little lambda function. So a lambda function is just a function with no name. It can only have one statement, and it returns a value, right? So it takes x, and x is going to be the row. And then I'm just combining the row state and the row percentage and formatting them a little bit, right? And axis 1 says that we're going to go down and not across. All right, my pop-up, I'm going to write this as a function, not as a lambda, and I'm going to give it a name because it does a little more work. I create this f string that actually has a little bit of HTML in it. I've got a level 4 header. I make it bold, and I'm going to use the full name as that header. Then I show the total population as a raw number and the Spanish speakers as a raw number here, right? And this BR just means put a new line, and since this is the last line, we don't even need it. I'll just delete that as we go through. All right. So get the data we want. Calc percent. Create a color map function, right? So we get the min, the max, and we're going to put that into the style. So the style column is going to hold the specific color for the choropleth and then some general styles that I want for all of my shapes in the map. Not here. We'll say make tooltip and pop-up columns. All right, so we've done all that stuff. Now, when we do our layers, we're actually going to add the data itself, the pop-ups, and the tooltips separately. So we're going to use Folium, and Folium is the mapping package. So first thing we're going to do is create a pop-up, and we're going to say from these fields, and then I want labels false, right? So I don't want pop-up to be part of the label. I just want just the data that's in the pop-up field. I do the same thing here for tooltip, but we're adding a couple things. Specifically, we can add some CSS style to it, and you don't have to do this. You could delete this altogether, but it just, you're going to see it makes a slightly more stylized, nicer tooltip when we mouse over it. Now, instead of creating a map directly, first thing we're going to do is create a layer, and I'm calling it Spanish layer. And I use this Folium feature group. Now a feature group is what Folium calls a layer. And I create that, right? Then I use Folium GeoJSON function, and that takes my data frame, the tooltip, and the pop-ups, and that is going to create the map from our data set in a way that we can add it to the layer, right? So we create the map, and then I call add to on that map, and I add it to Spanish layer. Last thing I do here, I create the base map and add the layer to it, and then obviously I show it at the end. So let's run this, make sure we didn't break anything. Now, you see where we add layer control to our base map? Once we add layer control, we get this little pop-up, and it lets us toggle layers on and off. So far we only have one layer. But it looks pretty nice. So this is this layer. We can see this layer is called Spanish. And because I called it Spanish here, I could call it % Spanish speakers, for example, and then it would show here once we reload it. But we're not going to do that right now because we want to move on to this example. So what we're going to do is add a second layer to this map. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it for Chinese speakers, and we're going to use a different color map, right? So I can take all this, copy it, Control C. That was Control A to highlight it all, Control C to copy it. And then now let's do it for Chinese. I go in here and I need to change a bunch of things. So everywhere it says ES, I'm going to change that to CN. Now I'm doing Control D, and that's going to highlight, oh, sorry. Control D is highlighting everywhere that I use ES, and it's going to let me change this all in one spot. Okay, and I'm just going to type CN one time, and it's changed it in all those places. But I see like I have a lot more things I need to change. Here is Spanish. I'll do it again and change that to Chinese. Scanning through row.Chinese here. Chinese speakers. We'll call it Chinese layer. Add it to Chinese layer. We're going to add Chinese layer to our base map. Okay, so let's go back up here and let's run this code, but we won't do the layer control. We'll just create the layer, and we won't add it anywhere. So we'll comment out this stuff, but we're going to have Spanish layer, and it's going to have our map, but we're not going to show anything right now. Well, let's run that. Okay, and then if we didn't break anything, let's do Chinese layer, add to base. Let's also do Spanish layer dot add to base, right? So we're going to put them both on there, and then we're going to add this layer control. We need to add our layers first, otherwise they won't show up in the layer control, and then we'll show the base map. Okay, let's run this and see what we get. So here we go. We have our map. And I have our layer control. And you can see we have 2 layers. Chinese and Spanish. But remember how I said I was going to use different colors? I forgot to. So I think it all worked, but let's change the color map. Let's, instead of reds, let's use blues. We'll run it again. Don't worry, I'll edit out the time so we don't need to wait. You see we got this pop-up. Sometimes Colab gets out of sync with itself. If you're not working with another person, you can basically always do show diff and then save your changes, and it should save your latest changes, right? If you don't have it open in multiple browsers or 2 windows, or you're working with another partner, that's a safe thing to do. All right, let's see how we did. So here we go. If we want to see the Spanish speakers, we get them in red. Want to see the Chinese speakers, we get them in blue. And you can see, it's like when we're looking at the data, New York and California definitely are darker than the other states. A little bit of weirdness from Colab, but we can handle that. All right. That is how you make layers. Now, we have a lot of languages, and this is a lot of code to be copying and pasting around. So anytime we start copying and pasting a lot of code like this, that's when we should be thinking, maybe I can write a function that does this. So I can do every language and write the code one time, right? That is like the key thing to computer programming, to software engineering, is thinking of ways to abstract our code so that we can write reusable code objects that take different data and give us different results with different inputs, but using the same algorithm or using the same processes. What we're going to do is take this code and convert it to a function. Boom. So right now, I take that code and I'll leave this as it is, but we're going to write a new function called lang layer, so language layer, right? So first thing I need to do, I call def. It says I'm writing a function. We just did this for pop-ups, for tooltips, for style. It's not new. We give the function a name, and then we decide what data it needs. So we're going to need the data frame. We're going to need to know what language to use, and we're going to need to know what color map to use for that language, right? So this comment I'm going to delete because it doesn't make sense anymore. So let's call this data, a more generic name. That's our first thing. I'm going to use that Control D, Command D. I'm going to find all the CNs. And I'm going to rename them data. I don't want to rename this last one. So let's go back and change that back to CN. Let's put this in a new cell. So we'll have the function will be its own thing, right? And then we'll call it after. All right. So we're creating this lang layer. So the first thing we do, we get the data, but it's not going to be Chinese all the time. So we're going to pass in that column name as a parameter called lang, right? So then it'll work for any language that's in our data set. That's a column name, not just for one. All right. Again, here, when we get the percentage, we can't use Chinese. We're going to have to use lang. And you can't use that dot notation with a variable. You need to use this index square bracket notation. Okay, let's go through carefully. So this part should work fine. CMap, we're not always going to use blues. We want that to be a variable. And we'll just call it CMap. We'll call it CMap name. Just so we don't confuse it with our existing CMap variable. Okay. Normalize should work. The style function should work fine. Let's see here. We have row Chinese. We're going to have to change that to be row Lang. Pop-up is looking good. Tooltip is looking good. The feature name, we're going to have to put that in there. So let's use an F string and let's put Lang in there. And then let's call this function called title. That'll capitalize the first letter in the language, right? So that'll work okay. And then it's not going to be called Chinese layer. Let's just rename that to be a more generic layer. And this stuff shouldn't be in our function at all. Once we create the layer and add our data to it, we're just going to return the layer. Okay. So we have a function that creates a new layer for any language in our data set. And I run it and nothing happens, right? Because functions, we defined it, but they just wait for us to call them to execute them. So now it's waiting for us to use it. And here's where we're going to use it. So we're going to get one layer for Spanish, and we're going to use reds. One layer for Chinese, and we're going to use blues. One layer for Arabic, and we'll use greens. Create our base map. Let's zoom in a little more. Zoom it up to 5. And then we add each layer to the base, add the layer control, and you see we're calling our function 3 times. We wrote the code 1 time. All right. And we have our map. We have our layers. These are Arabic speakers. We can see they're concentrated in Michigan. We can turn that off. We have our Chinese speakers. See they're concentrated in New York and California. Turn that off. We have our Spanish speakers, and we can see that they're concentrated along the borders and the states with lots of big cities, immigration, right? That is how you can use a function to write reusable code. And now that we have that function, it's really easy. If we just want to throw in another layer, we can do that. All right. So let me just save this again. And I want to point out that it actually takes a little while. That took 50 seconds to run, almost a minute. Give it a little bit of time. If you're running this in Colab, it might need a minute, but oh. Let's see. Oh, I forgot to add French to the map. So well, here we are. Here's our map. Interesting. So we got Louisiana, because we also have the Cajun speakers, Maryland, and New Hampshire. So I'm thinking that New Hampshire, because they have this border with Quebec, right? Okay. So we have our layer control, have our nice pop-ups. And we learned how to use functions to write reusable code here. In the end, I think I'm going to do this as just one video, even though I said several videos at the beginning. I'll just create the the links you can click through and click on what you want. We did several things today. We dropped null columns. We looked at a regular for loop. We did some list and dictionary comprehensions. A little bit of practice with working with dictionaries and lists in general. That style function again. And then we learned how to write reusable functions and to make layers on a map. I hope you enjoy. Any questions, of course, let me know.